On May 26, 2013, a 29-year-old cook named Harrison O'Keefe survived for 60 hours inside a sunken tugboat sitting on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, 100 feet below the surface. He was not a diver. He had no oxygen tank, no wetsuit, no training in underwater survival. He had a small bottle of Coca-Cola and a single flashlight that died within the first few hours. Around him in the darkness, 12 of his crewmates were already dead. The ship had sunk in less than 4 minutes. The water outside his tiny air pocket was 84 degrees Fahrenheit and full of the things that live in warm Atlantic water at that depth. He survived because of physics he did not know the name of, decisions he made in complete darkness, and a choice he made on the first day to keep moving rather than stop. This is not a story about luck. It is a story about what the human body can do when the mind refuses to give up, and what happens when the ocean, for once, loses. Harrison O'Keefe. The name is his own. No colonial erasure here, no recorded identity lost to bureaucratic indifference. He was born in 1984 in Warri, in the Delta state of southern Nigeria. He was a cook on commercial vessels, a trade he had worked for several years, feeding crews on the supply ships that serviced the oil platforms scattered across the Gulf of Guinea. What we know about him before May 26, 2013 comes from his own interviews, conducted with Nigerian and international media in the weeks after his rescue. He was religious. He kept a Bible verse on his person when he worked. His wife, Rescue, her actual name, had texted him the morning the ship sank, asking him to be careful. He had not yet replied when the ocean took the vessel. What he knew with complete clarity in those first minutes after the ship capsized was this: the water was coming in fast, it was dark, and he was alone. To understand what Harrison endured, you have to understand two things about the Sunken 4, what it was and what the ocean floor it sank onto was like. The Sunken 4 was a tugboat, 32 meters long, operated by West African Ventures and contracted to the oil company Chevron to service platforms in the Escravos terminal region off the coast of Nigeria's Delta state. Tugboats are working ships, not built for passengers. They are dense with mechanical systems, narrow corridors, and compartmentalized sections designed to keep the vessel functional, not comfortable. They are not built with survival spaces in mind. The Gulf of Guinea, where the ship went down, is one of the busiest stretches of commercial shipping water in the world. It is also one of the most dangerous. The underwater terrain off the Nigerian coastline drops steeply from the continental shelf into water that gets dark fast. At the location where the Sunken 4 sank, approximately 40 kilometers off the mouth of the Escravos River, the seafloor sits at roughly 30 meters, or about 100 feet. That depth is significant for a specific reason we will return to. The water temperature in that region of the Atlantic hovers around 28 to 30 degrees Celsius year-round, warm enough to sustain large populations of marine life, including sharks. Commercial diving companies working in this region routinely use shark deterrent protocols during any extended underwater operation. This is standard practice, not paranoia. No one recorded the exact wave height on the morning of May 26th, but weather data from that day shows typical conditions for the late dry season in the Gulf of Guinea. Moderate swells, 1.5 to 2 meters, with occasional larger sets. Not a catastrophic storm, just the sea being the sea. The Sunken 4 was anchored to a Chevron-operated oil barge when a wave, probably larger than average for that day, hit the ship at an angle that broke the anchor lines. The ship rolled. Once it started rolling, the sequence of events was fast and mechanical and entirely predictable. Water entered the lower decks. Compartments flooded in sequence. The vessel went from upright to inverted to sinking in under 4 minutes. 12 men on board died that morning. Some were swept directly into the water. Some were trapped in flooding compartments. The exact circumstances of each death were not publicly documented, which is its own kind of erasure. 12 names attached to the same terse incident report. Harrison survived because of where he was standing. At the moment the ship capsized, Harrison O'Keefe was in the toilet. Not the sleeping quarters, not the deck, not the dining area. The toilet. This specific location meant he was toward the stern of the ship, in a section that, as the vessel inverted and sank, happened to trap a pocket of air. He felt the ship roll and immediately grabbed whatever he could reach to brace himself. The water hit him fast and cold. Not cold by absolute standards, but cold compared to the ambient air, cold enough to shock. He described it later as feeling like the ship was eating itself. Everything was noise and pressure, and then sudden darkness as the lights failed. He moved by feel. He pushed through a doorway, then another, working toward higher spaces, which, in an inverted ship, meant moving toward what had been the floor. The water was rising around him. He found a mattress floating in a submerged berth and dragged it with him to a small engineering space near the anti-roll tanks. Here, At the highest accessible point of the inverted ship, an air pocket had formed. The mattress gave him something to stand on above the waterline. The water stopped rising at chest height. Then it dropped slightly. Then it stabilized. Harrison stood in complete darkness, in water up to his waist, inside a sunken ship on the ocean floor, 100 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. He had no way of knowing if anyone above knew where the ship had gone down. He had no way of knowing if the air pocket would hold. He had no way of knowing how long the oxygen would last. He had a small bottle of Coca-Cola. He had a whiskey bottle, empty, that he found floating in the dark. He had his faith and the Bible verse he kept on his person, which he could not read because there was no light. He started to wait. Let me walk through exactly what Harrison was dealing with in that air pocket, because the physics matter here. When a ship sinks and inverts, air doesn't simply disappear. If a compartment is sealed enough, not perfectly, but well enough, the air is compressed by the water pressure around it but cannot fully escape. In a space roughly the size of a large bathroom, Harrison had somewhere between 1.2 and 1.5 cubic meters of trapped air, according to the estimates made by the diving team that later rescued him. The challenge was carbon dioxide. Every breath Harrison took consumed oxygen and produced CO2. In a sealed space, CO2 builds up faster than oxygen depletes. At normal atmospheric CO2 levels of 0.04%, a person functions fine. At around 5%, cognitive function begins to deteriorate. At 10%, consciousness becomes impaired. At high enough levels, it kills. Historians and diving physiologists still debate exactly how Harrison's air supply stayed viable for 60 hours. The most likely explanation, supported by the rescue team's assessment, is that the compartment was not perfectly sealed. Small amounts of ocean water were slowly displacing a small amount of air, creating a slow but consistent refresh of the gas mixture. Not enough to flood the space, just enough to keep the CO2 from reaching lethal levels. He also kept his breathing slow. He described this himself, deliberately slowing his breath, trying not to panic, trying to move as little as possible to conserve oxygen. This is not an intuitive response to terror. Most people in that situation would hyperventilate, which would have accelerated CO2 buildup and made the physics work against him faster. The fact that Harrison managed his breathing with enough control to slow it down is not a small thing. It is, depending on which physiological account you trust, one of the primary reasons he was still alive when the divers arrived. His body was doing other things too. Dehydration was setting in within the first 12 hours. The Coca-Cola extended his hydration marginally, but 350 milliliters of liquid is not enough for a man standing in anxiety and heat for 2.5 days. His core temperature fluctuated as the water around him pulled heat from his lower body. He experienced hypercapnia, elevated CO2 levels, which at sublethal concentrations produces headaches, drowsiness, and a specific kind of mental fog that makes it harder to think clearly. He thought about his wife. He said this in every interview afterward. He thought about rescue and about seeing her again. He stood in the water and waited. Modern psychology has a useful framework for understanding what Harrison was managing internally during those 60 hours. It is called acute stress response theory, and the condensed version of it goes like this. The human brain, when faced with a threat to survival, does one of three things. It fights, it runs, or, and this is the one most people don't talk about, it freezes. Freezing is not cowardice. It is a neurological process, a kind of system overload where the brain cannot select a response because no response seems viable. In an environment where fighting and running are both literally impossible, you cannot fight the ocean. You cannot run from a sunken ship. The brain has a fourth gear that rarely gets mentioned. It can choose to endure. Psychologist Lawrence Gonzalez, who has spent years studying survival cognition, has written that the people who survive seemingly unsurvivable situations tend to share one specific characteristic. They accept the reality of their situation fully and immediately, without the denial that consumes energy and time. They don't say, "This can't be happening." They say, "This is happening," and then they ask, "What do I do next?" Evidence from Harrison's own account suggests he reached that acceptance quickly. He stopped trying to find a way out early on, when it became clear there wasn't one. He focused instead on the air pocket, on his breathing, on staying calm, on the small physical tasks available to him. Finding the mattress, finding the Coca-Cola, positioning himself in the highest point of the space. These weren't random behaviors. They were, whether Harrison knew it or not, textbook survival psychology in action. Give yourself tasks. Manage your environment, however small your environment is. Anchor yourself to a reason to survive. His reason was a name, rescue. Days became indistinguishable in the dark. Harrison later said he lost track of time quickly. He didn't know if it was day or night. He had no reference points except the water level around him and the slow accumulation of his own physical deterioration. The growing headache, the thirst, the cramps in his legs from standing for so long. At some point, he believes it was the second day, though he couldn't be certain. He heard something above him, a sound that didn't belong to the ship, tapping or movement. He made noise. He shouted. The sound stopped, or he imagined it stopped, or it wasn't what he thought it was. Nothing came. He kept waiting. The near failure came on what was likely the second night, though the timeline, depending on Harrison's account versus the rescue team's log, places this ambiguously in the sequence. The water in the pocket began to rise. Not quickly, not catastrophically, but it rose several inches over the course of what felt to Harrison like a few hours, slowly shrinking the airspace above his head. He couldn't tell why. Possibly the ship shifted on the sea floor. Possibly a seal somewhere in the compartment was slowly failing. Possibly the tidal current above, 60 hours into the ordeal, was affecting the pressure dynamics in ways too subtle to identify precisely. Harrison responded by pressing himself as flat as possible against the ceiling of the compartment, which, in the inverted ship, was the original floor. He stretched his neck upward. He kept breathing slowly. He talked aloud to keep himself conscious, repeating prayers he had memorized, including Psalm 54, which asks for deliverance from enemies and strangers. The water stabilized. Then slowly, it dropped back to its previous level. For a moment, the math had seemed to be running out. Then it didn't. He was still there. Still breathing, still waiting. On the surface, the search had been ongoing since the morning of the 26th. West African Ventures had contracted DCN Diving, a South African commercial diving company, to locate the wreck and recover the bodies of the crew. This was a recovery operation. No one expected survivors. The ship had been on the bottom for more than 2 days. The dive team reached the Jascon 4 on the morning of May 28th. Lead diver Nico van Heerden and his team descended to 30 meters with underwater cutting equipment and video cameras, prepared to enter the wreck and bring out the bodies of 12 dead sailors. Van Heerden later described what happened when he entered the ship as one of the most disorienting moments of his career. He was cutting through a passage near the stern when his gloved hand was grabbed. He screamed into his regulator. His heart rate spiked so fast the monitoring equipment recorded it as a medical event. Harrison O'Keefe had grabbed him. Van Heerden's first instinct, documented in his own account published after the rescue, was that he was hallucinating. A live man inside a wreck that had been submerged for 60 hours was not in his operational planning. He recovered within seconds, signaled to his team, and began the process of getting Harrison out alive. Getting Harrison out was not straightforward. It took 4 hours. The core problem was decompression. Harrison had been breathing pressurized air at 30 meters depth for 2.5 days. His blood and tissues were saturated with nitrogen at levels far beyond what a normal dive produces. If he ascended too quickly, the nitrogen would form bubbles in his bloodstream, decompression sickness, colloquially known as the bends, which can cause strokes, paralysis, or death. The dive team brought Harrison a hot water suit, feeding warm water through tubing connected to a surface heater to prevent hypothermia during the slow ascent. They brought him a full diving rig. They walked him through the ascent protocol in a ship corridor while he was still disoriented, still dehydrated, still processing the fact that people had come. He was taken to a decompression chamber on the surface vessel and held there for 60 hours, almost exactly as long as he had been trapped underwater, while his nitrogen levels slowly returned to safe concentrations. According to the medical report filed by the ship's physician, Harrison emerged from the decompression chamber on May 30th, suffering from dehydration, significant weight loss, skin maceration from prolonged water contact, and acute psychological stress. He was not permanently physically damaged. He did not have decompression sickness. He had lost approximately 12 kilograms in the 60 hours he was trapped. He asked for his wife immediately. This story sits in the record now as one of the most documented accidental underwater survival cases in modern history. The rescue dive was filmed. Van Heerden's team was using cameras throughout, and the footage of Harrison emerging from the darkness, grabbing the diver's arm, has been seen tens of millions of times. The footage is hard to watch without feeling something shift, not because it is dramatic in a produced way, but because it is so specific and so raw. You can see the diver recoil. You can see Harrison's hands, pale from days in the water, reaching out. There is no music. There is no narration. There is just a man alive where no man should be. What the footage cannot show is the 60 hours before it, the darkness, the breathing breathing, the water rising and falling. The Bible verse he repeated by memory because the flashlight was long dead. The name he kept returning to. No one recorded what he thought about on that first night, when he understood the ship had gone to the bottom and the other voices had stopped. We can't know for sure what he felt in that silence, but evidence from his own interviews suggests he made a decision. He was not going to stop moving. He was not going to sit down in the water. As long as there was air, he would stand. It asks uncomfortable questions. This story. It asks why 12 men died in the same disaster that one man walked away from, and whether the answer is as simple as position in physics, or whether there is something more uncomfortable in that arithmetic. It asks what it means that the oil industry for which the Jascon 4 was working has since made no publicly documented change to its crew survival protocols in the Gulf of Guinea. It asks whether we give enough serious attention to what happens to the bodies and minds of men who work the supply ships that keep the oil platforms running, far enough offshore that most people never think about them at all. Harrison O'Keefe returned to work on ships. This is a detail that tends to stop people. That a man who survived 60 hours on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean went back to sea. He did it, he has said in interviews, because it was his work and his life, and he saw no reason to let one night change what he was. That's the most unsettling part of this story, not the survival. The return. The fact that what most people would call a defining, identity-breaking event was, to the man who lived it, something that happened and then was over. He endured not because he had special training or special equipment or special luck. He endured because he managed his breathing, he found the highest point in a sinking space, he kept himself moving, and he held onto a name in the dark for 2.5 days until someone came to get him. That choice, to stand, to breathe, to wait, made in total darkness, without any certainty that anyone was looking, is not easy to categorize. It isn't heroism in the way movies depict it. It isn't luck in the way people mean when they want to diminish a story. It is something closer to the simplest, most fundamental thing a human being can do. He chose to still be there when the divers arrived, and he was. If stories like this make you stop and take in how strange and specific human survival can be, subscribe to the channel and share this video. More true stories of the limits people hit and how they respond are coming. We'll see you there.